A couple of years back, I published a book, The Neoliberalism. The book was written shortly before the US went to war in Iraq, and it was finished just about the time when Baghdad was occupied. And like everybody else at the time, I was kind of really confused as to exactly why and what the motivations were for that particular action, particularly since it was, I should have thought, evident to anybody that the weapons of mass destruction argument was a hoax and that various other arguments were a hoax. So I concentrated on a couple of issues. One was the long-standing geopolitical interest of the United States in the Gulf region because of its oil resources, and not simply from the narrow sense of preserving American situation, but dealing with potential rivalries, and in particular the rivalry that was emerging with China. And I think that rivalry is very, very present in the world. You'll find echoes of it in Sudan, Nigeria, all over the Middle East, in Central Asia. There is, I think, a growing conflict over who's going to control the oil resources for that reason. So I think there was an argument there which was a serious one and which we still should take on board. The second argument I used was that there's a relation, organic relation, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, between external activities, particularly imperialist activities abroad, and domestic circumstances. And as she put it, imperial ventures abroad and tyranny at home go hand in hand, and that I thought that the disciplining of the US internally was just as important as the militarism abroad, and that the militarism everywhere was pretty much taking over. And I really liked one of those little remarks that Bush lets drop every now and again when he kind of said, introducing the Attorney General, he kind of said, "I wonder why he's called a general. Well, I guess it's because we're all in the military now." And I think this total militarization of everything is in the sort of subconscious of this administration, so that was important too. But then about the time the book was published, another event occurred which made me think of something else which I hadn't really taken into account very, very fully and very properly, at least not directly. And that was that in September 2003, Paul Bremer began upon a restructuring of the state apparatus in Iraq, the whole legal state apparatus. And during the rest of the several months that followed, he continued to do this in a whole series of decrees which restructured how Iraq was to be governed and what the state apparatus was to do. This was, of course, considered by many to be an illegal thing to do for an occupying power, and it was illegal under the Hague and the Geneva Conventions. And so one of the things that then happened was a very hurried handover to some interim government which was declared by the US to be sovereign, even when the rules of transition from the Coalition Provisional Authority to this interim government were that it could not change any of these decrees, nor could it write any new ones. So it was actually bound by these decrees that Bremer had issued. Now, these decrees, I think it's important to, we can go over them in detail, but broadly they go something like this. The decrees said that everything in the Iraqi economy was to be open to private ownership, and therefore privatization of everything except oil resources was critical. The second thing was there was to be absolutely no barrier to foreign direct investment into Iraq, and in particular foreign ownership of anything going on in Iraq. The third thing was there was to be free trade with the rest of the world. And the fourth thing was there was to be no barrier to the repatriation of profits out of the country to abroad. There were other things too, like the conservative dream of the flat tax was recommended and imposed. There was particular attention being paid to intellectual property rights and so on, but those were other elements in this package. And this package organized the Iraqi state in a very particular way. And when I read all of this, I had this kind of throwback, as actually quite a few people did at the time, when I suddenly thought about what had happened in Chile after the coup of 1973, when Pinochet dislodged Allende. And within a couple of years, Pinochet had I guess it's an awkward place to say this, summoned the so-called Chicago boys to come down to, well, no, they didn't have to come down because they were already there. The Chicago boys to restructure the economy, and they did it exactly the same thing. They privatized everything except the key resource, which was copper. It's interesting. But everything else was to be open to foreign direct investment, foreign ownership, no barriers to repatriation of foreign profits, etc. Natural resources were to be sort of open up to private exploitation and all the rest of it. So what it suddenly seemed to me was that from 1973 to 2003, you had a 30-year period where this kind of idea of a particular kind of state apparatus, which was structured in that way, was going to be fundamental to what politics was about. And that neoliberal state apparatus, I choose to call a neoliberal state. It is the institutional arrangements of a neoliberal state which believe that human welfare is to be maximized and enhanced by a system based on private property, free markets, free trade, entrepreneurial liberties, freedoms, and the like. So this neoliberal imposition seemed to me to be a very important thing to look at more coherently. And in particular, the first cut at it would say, well, maybe this is what American imperial policy has been about all along, that is the imposition of neoliberal state apparatuses wherever it can. And when you look very carefully at something like what does the IMF do and its structural adjustment programs, you'd say, well, it imposes neoliberal state apparatuses, and that's what it's doing. It's an agent of US imperial power. So there would be a kind of a tendency to say that the neoliberalization of the global economy has been, as it were, a direct consequence of American imperial interventions with these two violent events, i.e. Chile at the beginning and Iraq at the end, sort of bookends of a whole history of neoliberalization. But then it seemed to me that this was not the full story at all, and it couldn't be the full story. After all, one of the main agents of neoliberalization was Margaret Thatcher, and I couldn't imagine that Margaret Thatcher would simply regard herself as somehow or other pushed to what she was doing by US power. And when I started to think further about it, I started to think, well, you know, the other thing that's happened in the world where a kind of neoliberalization has emerged has been China, and you could not say that Deng Xiaoping in 1978-79, when he initiated this big wave of reform around that period, was somehow or other responding to US imperial pressure. So it seemed to me that the story of neoliberalization was a very much more complicated one, and I therefore wanted to pay attention to it and to try to give a narrative account of where neoliberalization came from, how it worked through uneven geographical development, how it worked differently in different places at different times, how, for example, it occurred in New Zealand, or how it occurred in Sweden, or how it occurred in Mozambique, or how it took place in India, and what degree of it took place, because the process has not ended. A lot of the struggle you're seeing now in the European Union is precisely over the degree of neoliberalization of the economy. And that the election in Germany seems to me to be partly about a resistance to further neoliberalization, and it's odd to find somebody like Chirac saying, saying, no, we don't want further neoliberalization. And it's Tony Blair who's pushing the neoliberal project and the others who are resisting it. So there's still a very complicated story of struggle around this process of neoliberalization. So what I wanted to do then was to partly tell the story as a historical